Hey guys, tonight we're doing something different. You've survived countless winters, maybe even a few blizzards. So yeah, you probably won't survive this, but let's pretend it's October 1846 and you're part of the Donner Party, trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The snow is falling faster than anyone expected. Your food is running low, and the golden promise of California feels like a cruel joke whispered by the wind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not going to chase you with an axe over it. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching this down in the comments. I love knowing who else is awake during these quiet hours. Now, dim the lights. Maybe light a candle for that gentle glow, and let's walk together into one of history's most desperate survival stories. You wake up on July 20th, 1846, and the morning feels different. The wagon train has been moving steadily westward for months, but today there's tension crackling through the camp like electricity before a storm. You stretch your aching back against the hard wooden slats of your wagon bed, listening to the sound of oxen snorting and pawing at the dirt. The air smells like dust and possibility, mixed with the ever-present scent of livestock and leather. You can hear voices outside, not the usual morning chatter, but something more urgent. James Reed's voice carries across the camp, deep and confident. George Donner responds in his measured farmer's tone. They're talking about time, about roots, about a letter. You pull yourself up and peer over the wagon's edge. The landscape stretches endlessly in every direction, broken only by sagebrush and the occasional cottonwood marking a distant creek. The sun hasn't fully crested the horizon, but already the air shimmers with heat that promises another scorching day on the trail. But first, you need to understand something. This isn't just another morning on the Oregon Trail. This is the morning that will seal your fate and the fate of 80 other souls traveling with you. Because in a few hours, you're going to make a decision that seems perfectly reasonable. Sensible even. You're going to take a shortcut. The letter came from Lansford Hastings, carried by a lone horseman, who appeared like a mirage against the vast emptiness. Hastings promised a new route, shorter by several hundred miles, that would save weeks of travel and get you to California before the mountain snows blocked the passes. What he didn't mention in his letter was that he'd never actually travelled this route with wagons. He'd scouted it on horseback, which is like testing a recipe by smelling it instead of cooking it. You climb down from your wagon, boots hitting the packed earth with a soft thud. The morning ritual begins around you. Women coaxing fires back to life from banked coals, men checking the oxen's hooves and adjusting the yokes, children being roused from sleep, their voices mixing with the lowing of cattle and the creak of leather. You're not wealthy like the Reeds with their fancy 2-story wagon, but you're not destitute either. You've brought enough supplies for the journey, or so you calculated back in Independence, Missouri. Salt pork, flour, beans, coffee, and a few precious luxuries like sugar and dried fruit. Everything carefully weighed against the oxen's ability to pull it over 2,000 miles of wilderness. Listen to the morning sounds around you. The rhythmic chopping of someone splitting kindling, the hiss of bacon hitting a hot pan, a baby crying in the breen wagon, quickly hushed by its mother. These are the sounds of people still believing in their own invincibility, still trusting that planning and determination will see them through. Virginia Reed, just 12 years old, writes letters to her cousins back in Illinois. She describes the adventure, the vast sky, the buffalo herd stretching to the horizon. She doesn't know that 50 years later she'll write another letter, warning future emigrants to never take no cut-offs and hurry along as fast as you can. The Hastings Cutoff beckons like a siren song. Why wouldn't you take it? You're already gambling everything on this journey. Your farm back east, your sister's savings, your family's future. What's one more calculated risk? You watch the wagons begin to form up for the day's travel. The Donners with their 3 wagons loaded with goods to trade in California. The Reeds with their hired hands and fancy supplies. The Breens, a large Irish Catholic family with 7 children. Louis Kesselberg, the German immigrant with his pregnant wife and toddler daughter. All of you linked by a common dream and soon a common nightmare. The fork in the trail approaches at midday. To the right, the established route followed by thousands before you. To the left, Hastings' promised shortcut, unmarked and uncertain. You don't hesitate. None of you do. The shortcut it is. Here's what you don't know as your wagon wheels turn onto that fateful left fork. You've just added an extra month to your journey instead of saving time. You'll spend precious weeks hacking through the Wasatch mountains, your men exhausted from building a road as they travel. You'll lose cattle in the brutal salt desert crossing. Most importantly, you'll arrive at the Sierra Nevada a month later than you should have, just in time for the earliest winter storms in years. But right now, rolling across the Wyoming prairie with the sun warm on your face and California gleaming in your imagination, the future still feels bright. You don't know that you're already dead. You just don't know it yet. The wagon wheels keep turning, carrying you toward a destiny that will make your name synonymous with survival at its most desperate. The oxen plod forward, step by step, toward the mountains that will become your prison. You thought the desert was difficult. You thought the river crossings were challenging. You were adorably naive, because now you're standing in the Wasatch Mountains, staring at terrain that seems designed by someone who actively hates wagon trains. Trees thick as cathedral pillars block every path. Boulders the size of houses sit exactly where you need to go, and somewhere ahead, supposedly, Lansford Hastings is blazing a trail for you to follow. Except he isn't. He's already moved on with another wagon train, leaving behind notes tucked under rocks like the world's least helpful treasure hunt. Turn left at the big tree. Which big tree? There are thousands of them. Follow the creek until it bends. Every creek in these mountains bends more than a politician's promise. The sound that dominates your world now is the rhythmic thunk-thunk-thunk of axes biting into wood. Your men are building a road as they travel, cutting through forests that have stood undisturbed since before Columbus. Every mile forward requires hours of back-breaking labour. The oxen stand patient and dumb while grown men argue about which direction to hack next. You can smell the sap bleeding from fresh-cut stumps, sweet and sticky in the mountain air. Pine needles carpet the ground, making every step treacherous when they're wet with dew. Your hands are blistered from handling ropes and tools, your back aches from lifting rocks and pushing wagon wheels out of ruts. But the worst part isn't the physical labour. It's watching your supplies disappear. Every day spent cutting trail is a day not making progress toward California. Every dawn brings you closer to winter and farther from safety. The salt pork gets rationed. The flour sack feels lighter when you lift it. And in the back of everyone's mind lurks the same terrible calculation. How long can our food last? Here's your historical fact for the night. The Donner Party spent nearly a month cutting through just 36 miles of the Wasatch Mountains. 36 miles. You could walk that distance in a day on flat ground. Instead, it takes 4 weeks of the hardest labour any of you have ever done, while other emigrant trains on the established route are making 20 miles a day across easy terrain. James Reed starts looking haggard, the responsibility of leadership weighing on him like a millstone. His fancy wagon, once the envy of the train, now seems like a liability. All that elegant woodwork and those glass windows just mean more weight for the suffering oxen to pull uphill. You notice the children have stopped running alongside the wagons. They're too tired, or maybe they sense the growing tension among the adults. Even little Virginia Reed has put away her writing materials. There's nothing cheerful left to write about. The nights bring a different kind of torment. You huddle around smoky fires while the temperature drops and the wind moans through the trees like something alive and hungry. Conversations that used to be about California's opportunities now focus on more immediate concerns. How much flour do we have left? Are the oxen strong enough for another day of pulling through mud? Should we abandon some of our possessions to lighten the load? Listen to the sound of doubt creeping into the voices around the fire. Louis Keseberg's heavily accented English becomes more clipped when he's worried. The Breen children whisper instead of laughing. Someone coughs in the darkness, a wet sound that could mean anything but suggests everything. And still you press forward, because turning back would mean admitting the whole enterprise was a mistake. None of you are ready for that level of honesty yet. The dream of California still pulls you forward, even as the nightmare of the mountains tries to drag you back. But you're learning a harsh lesson about shortcuts. Sometimes the longer way around is shorter. Sometimes the road more travelled is more travelled for a good reason. Sometimes the clever move is the one that gets you killed. You wrap your blanket tighter and try not to think about how much time you've lost. Try not to calculate how many days until the Sierra Nevada passes fill with snow. Try not to imagine what happens if you don't make it through before winter settles in for good. The fire crackles lower, and somewhere in the darkness, A wolf howls. It sounds like laughter. You emerge from the Wasatch Mountains like survivors crawling from a shipwreck, exhausted but still breathing. The desert spreads before you, flat and seemingly endless, shimmering in the heat like a mirage made of salt and suffering. Hastings promised 40 miles of desert crossing. You'll learn he was off by half. It's actually 80 miles of the most godforsaken landscape God ever created. The salt crust crunches under your feet like broken bones. The sun hammers down from a sky the colour of old brass, reflecting off the white ground until you have to squint even with your hat pulled low. The air tastes metallic, like licking a coin, and every breath feels like inhaling fire. Your oxen are already suffering. Their tongues loll out, dark and swollen. They roll their eyes and bellow, a sound that echoes across the emptiness like the voices of the damned. Some of them are foaming at the mouth, driven mad by thirst and the alkaline dust that coats everything. You start the crossing with confidence because Hastings' notes mentioned water at the halfway point. There is no water at the halfway point. There's no water anywhere except in the barrels strapped to your wagons, and those are emptying fast. Not just for drinking, but for the animals, for cooking, for the hundred small needs that you never think about until water becomes more precious than gold. The desert doesn't just take your water, it takes your sense of time, your sense of direction, your sense of hope. The sun beats down during the day until the wagon seats are too hot to touch with bare skin. At night, the temperature plummets, until your teeth chatter and your breath forms clouds in the frigid air. Here's what the desert teaches you about desperation. When the oxen smell distant water, they bolt. Not walk faster and not pick up the pace, but bolt like their lives depend on it. Because their lives do depend on it. You watch teams break free from their yokes and stampede across the salt flats, dragging broken wagon tongues behind them, driven by an instinct older than civilization. Some of those oxen are never recovered. They disappear into the vast whiteness like ghosts, taking with them your ability to pull your wagons. Now you're faced with terrible choices. What do you abandon? The furniture your grandmother gave you? The books you brought to read in your new California home? The extra clothes, the tools, the small luxuries that made this journey bearable? You can hear the sound of families arguing in harsh whispers, trying to decide what pieces of their old life they can afford to leave behind. A china set gets buried in the salt, wrapped carefully in a tablecloth like a body. A rocking chair sits abandoned beside the trail, looking forlorn and out of place. Children cry when their toys are deemed too heavy to keep. The Reeds lose 18 oxen in one night. 18. James Reed, the man who brought the fanciest wagon and the most supplies, is suddenly one of the poorest members of your party. His elegant two-story wagon becomes a liability that has to be abandoned. Everyone pitches in to redistribute his family's essential possessions. But there's an undercurrent of fear. If it can happen to the Reeds, it can happen to anyone. You start to understand why other emigrants called this the long drive. Not because of the distance, though. 80 miles feels infinite when you're walking it in the desert heat. But because of what it drives out of you. Your illusions about the journey. Your faith in Lansford Hastings' promises. Your certainty that preparation and determination are enough to guarantee success. By the time you finally see the green line of the Truckee River in the distance, you've been walking for days. Your lips are cracked. Your eyes are red with salt dust, and your tongue feels like leather in your mouth. The children have stopped asking when you'll get there. They just trudge forward with the mechanical persistence of the thoroughly defeated. But you made it. You crossed the desert and lived. You should feel triumphant. Instead you feel hollow, like something essential has been burned out of you by the sun and salt. You've learnt that the landscape doesn't care about your dreams, your plans, or your preparations. It will take whatever it wants from you. And the only choice you have is whether to keep moving forward or lie down and let it take everything. The Truckee River tastes like paradise when you finally reach it. Cold, clean water that makes you remember what hope feels like. You and the oxen, and even the children drink until your bellies slosh. But even as you're celebrating survival, a dark thought creeps into your mind. If the desert was this hard and it was supposed to be the easy part compared to the mountains, what's waiting for you ahead? You look west toward the Sierra Nevada, those granite peaks that stand between you and California like a wall built by giants. Somewhere up there are passes that will either deliver you to safety or become your grave, and you've lost so much time, so many supplies, so many animals. The margin for error has evaporated like water in the desert heat. But you're committed now. Too far from home to turn back, too close to California to give up. The wheels keep turning toward the mountains, carrying you toward a winter that will test everything you thought you knew about survival, about civilized behavior, about the lengths human beings will go to stay alive. October 28th, 1846. You wake up to a world transformed overnight. What was brown earth and granite rock when you went to sleep is now buried under 6 inches of fresh snow, and more is falling. Fat, wet flakes that stick to everything and muffle all sound except the whisper of winter settling in for a long stay. This isn't supposed to happen yet. Not this early, not this much, not when you're still miles from the summit of the Sierra Nevada. You push back the canvas flap of your wagon and stare at the alien landscape, trying to process what this means for your chances of reaching California before the passes become impassable. The silence is profound, broken only by the soft patter of snowflakes landing on canvas and the occasional crack of a tree branch sagging under unexpected weight. Your breath forms clouds that hang in the still air like visible prayers. The oxen stand steaming in the cold, their dark hides contrasting sharply with the white world around them. Someone will later calculate that this is the earliest significant snowfall in the Sierra Nevada in over 30 years. You, of course, have no way of knowing this. All you know is that the landscape that seemed merely challenging yesterday now looks actively hostile. The trail ahead disappears into the white uncertainty, and every step forward will be a battle against increasingly deep drifts. You can hear the sound of shovels scraping against rock as the men try to clear a path. The metallic ring echoes off the granite walls of the pass, a rhythmic drumbeat of futility. For every few feet of trail they clear, the falling snow fills in twice as much. It's like trying to empty a lake with a teacup. The children press their faces against wagon canvas, watching the snow with the wonder that only those too young to understand danger can feel. They want to play in it, to build snowmen, to have snowball fights. Their parents' faces tell a different story. Tight lines around the eyes, worried glances between husband and wife, conversations conducted in whispers so the little ones won't overhear. Here's your historical fact for this frozen morning. Snow in the Sierra Nevada can accumulate at a rate of several feet per day during major storms. The passes you need to cross are already at 7,000 feet elevation, where the air is thin and the weather unpredictable even in good conditions. What you're facing isn't just an inconvenience. It's a death sentence with a slow, cold delivery method. George Donner cuts his hand trying to repair a broken wagon axle, and the simple injury that would have been merely annoying a month ago now becomes a potential disaster. Blood doesn't clot properly in the cold. Wounds heal slowly when you're not getting enough food. An infection becomes a killing threat when you're already weakened by the rigours of the trail. You watch him wrap the cut in a strip of cloth torn from his wife Tamsin's petticoat, and you notice how his hands shake. Not from the cold, though that's certainly a factor, but from the realisation that everything has changed. The comfortable margin of safety you thought you had has evaporated like breath in the freezing air. The snow keeps falling as you struggle forward, each step more difficult than the last. The oxen begin to falter, their hooves slipping on the icy rocks, their strength sapped by the effort of pulling heavy wagons through increasingly deep drifts. You can hear them breathing hard, see the steam rising from their flanks as they labour up the increasingly steep trail. Someone makes the decision to try one more push for the summit. If you can just get over the pass, if you can just reach the western slope where the snow isn't as deep, you might still make it to California before winter truly settles in. It's the kind of desperate optimism that feels rational when the alternative is admitting you're already dead. But the snow has other plans. By afternoon, the drifts are knee-deep and rising. The trail becomes invisible, marked only by the occasional blaze on a tree or cairn of stones. Your wagon wheels sink into the snow and stick, requiring all hands to push and pull while the oxen strain against their yokes. Listen to the sound of failure approaching. It starts as a whisper in the wind, grows to a murmur among the adults, becomes an argument between James Reed and Louis Keseberg about whether to abandon some wagons, and finally resolves into the terrible silence of acceptance. You're not going to make it over the pass, not today, not tomorrow, not before the snow gets too deep to travel. The realization settles over the group like the snow itself. Quiet and inexorable and utterly final. Someone suggests turning back, trying to reach a lower elevation where you might wait out the storm. But the way behind you is already impassable, filled with snow and blocked by abandoned wagons. Someone else proposes sending the strongest men ahead on foot to try to reach California and bring back help. But the snow is falling too fast, the visibility too poor, the risk too great. You're trapped. Not just delayed, not just inconvenienced, but genuinely, completely, potentially fatally trapped in the high Sierra Nevada with winter closing around you like a fist. The decision is made without formal discussion because there really isn't a decision to make. You'll have to stop here, build some kind of shelter, and wait for either the snow to melt or rescue to arrive. Neither option seems particularly likely as you watch the white flakes continue their relentless descent from the grey sky. By evening, the snow is a foot deep and still falling. You help build fires that hiss and sputter as the wet flakes land in the flames. The light reflects off the white ground, creating an eerie, otherworldly atmosphere that makes familiar faces look strange and shadows dance like spirits. You pull your blankets tighter and try not to think about how much food you have left, how long winter lasts in these mountains, how many people have died in places just like this one. The snow keeps falling, erasing the world you knew and replacing it with something alien and hostile. Tomorrow you'll start building the shelters that will either save your life or become your tomb. Tonight, you listen to the soft whisper of snowflakes and try to remember what warmth feels like. You wake up on the shore of what will later be called Truckee Lake, though right now it's just a body of water reflecting the grey sky like a mirror made of lead. The snow has stopped falling for the moment, but the world remains white and stagnant except for the sound of axes ringing against wood as your group begins the grim work of building winter quarters. The existing cabin stands like a beacon of hope in the wilderness. Built by previous travellers who got trapped here years ago, it's crude but solid, with log walls chinked with mud and a roof that only leaks in 3 places. It can shelter perhaps a dozen people if they don't mind sleeping in shifts and sharing air that quickly becomes thick with smoke and body odour. But you have more than 80 people, so 3 more structures need to rise from the snow-covered ground. You swing an axe until your arms ache, cutting down pines and firs, trimming branches, dragging logs through the snow with ropes that burn your hands even through gloves. The work generates heat, which feels good, but it also burns energy, which you can't spare. Every log has to be perfect. There's no room for waste, no opportunity for do-overs. Each tree represents hours of labour and precious calories you may need later for survival. You develop an eye for which trees will yield the best timber, which ones are too rotten to use, which ones are positioned so they'll fall where you need them instead of into the lake. The sound of construction echoes off the granite walls that surround the lake. Hammers driving wooden pegs, saws biting through green wood, men calling instructions to each other, in voices that echo strangely in the thin mountain air. It sure sounds hopeful, this noise of human industry. Instead, it sounds desperate. Here's what you learn about building shelter when your life depends on it. Every shortcut you take will try to kill you later. If you don't chink the gaps between logs properly, the wind will find every weakness and pour through like ice water. If you don't make the roof steep enough, the snow will accumulate until the weight collapses the whole structure. If you don't build the chimney correctly, you'll smoke yourself to death trying to stay warm. The women work as hard as the men, though their labour is less visible. They're cooking over open fires in the snow, trying to stretch dwindling supplies into meals that will keep everyone alive. They're sewing canvas and hides into blankets and clothing. They're tending children who don't understand why the adults all look so worried, why the games have stopped, why everyone speaks in whispers. Tamsin Donner emerges as a quiet leader among the women. A former schoolteacher from Massachusetts, she approaches survival with the same methodical intelligence she once brought to lesson planning. She organises inventory of food supplies, rations of medicine, schedules for who will cook and clean and tend the fires. Her voice never rises, never betrays panic, but her eyes reveal the calculations she's making. How many mouths to feed? How much food remains? How long winter lasts at this elevation? You notice the sounds changing as the work progresses. Less conversation, more focus. The jokes and banter that sustained morale during the early days of construction fade into grim efficiency. People save their breath for labour because breath is warmth, and warmth is survival. The lake begins to freeze around the edges, forming a rim of ice that grows wider each night. The sound of it cracking and reforming becomes part of the background noise, like the settling of a house or the tick of a clock. But this clock is counting down to something none of you want to reach. By the time the second cabin is half finished, you realise you're not just building shelters, you're building graves. Oh, they might keep you alive through the winter, if the snow melts early, if rescue arrives, if the food lasts longer than anyone expects. But the more likely outcome is that these cabins will become your final resting place, monuments to poor decisions and bad luck. Still, you keep building because the alternative is lying down in the snow and giving up. The human capacity for hope is both a blessing and a curse. It keeps you swinging the axe when logic says you should save your strength. It keeps you thinking about California when you should be thinking about conserving body heat. The third cabin goes up faster because you've learned from your mistakes, but also because desperation makes for efficient teachers. No wasted motion, no unnecessary conversation, no energy spent on anything that doesn't directly contribute to shelter from the cold and wind. You look around at what you've built and feel a mixture of pride and terror. Pride because it represents an enormous amount of human effort and ingenuity. Terror because it looks exactly like what it is, a last-ditch attempt to survive in a place that wants to kill you. The children gather pine boughs for bedding while the adults discuss sleeping arrangements. Who goes in which cabin? How to organise families while making the most efficient use of space and body heat. These conversations happen in low voices because everyone understands what they really represent. Decisions about who has the best chance of living through the winter. As the sun sets behind the granite peaks, painting the snow pink and gold, you stand back and survey your work. 4 rough shelters beside a lake that's freezing solid. 81 people with enough food for maybe a few weeks if rationed carefully. Winter just beginning in a mountain range known for storms that can last for days. You've built your winter camp. Now you have to live in it, or die in it. The lake doesn't care which. 7 miles away from the lake, the Donner families make their own desperate preparations for winter. George and Jacob Donner, along with their wives, children and hired hands, have stopped in a meadow beside Alder Creek. Unlike the lake camp with its existing cabin and proximity to the main trail, this spot offers nothing but open ground and the promise of water beneath the ice. You're helping build what can barely be called shelters. Not log cabins, not even proper lean-tos, but desperate assemblages of canvas, pine boughs and salvaged wagon parts that might keep the wind out if the wind is feeling cooperative. The snow falls steadily as you work, erasing your progress almost as fast as you can make it. George Donner's infected hand has gotten worse. What started as a simple cut from the broken wagon axle has swollen and begun to smell like meat left too long in the sun. His wife Tamsin tends it with whatever medicinal supplies she brought from Illinois, but you can see the worry in her eyes. She knows what infection means when you're trapped in the wilderness with no doctor and no way to get help. The children don't understand the gravity of their situation yet. 5-year-old Francis, 4-year-old Georgia, and 3-year-old Eliza Donner still play in the snow, their laughter bright and incongruous against the backdrop of adult desperation. They build snow forts and have snowball fights while their parents calculate how many days the remaining food will last if rationed carefully. Here's what you learn about family dynamics when survival is at stake. The normal rules change. Children become responsible for tasks they have never done before. Adults make decisions they never thought they'd have to make. The comfortable hierarchies of age and gender blur when everyone's job becomes staying alive. Tamsin Donner takes inventory of their supplies with the precision of a general, counting ammunition before a siege. Salt pork, flour, beans, dried fruit, coffee, sugar. Each item gets weighed, measured, divided by the number of mouths that need feeding and the number of days winter might last. The mathematics of survival are unforgiving. There's never enough and there's no way to get more. You can hear the sound of axes echoing across the meadow as the men cut firewood. Not just for tonight's fire, but for all the fires they'll need to burn through the winter. Trees that took decades to grow fall in minutes. They're sacrifice necessary for human survival. The wood needs to be cut, split, stacked and covered to keep it dry. It's back-breaking work that becomes more difficult as the snow deepens. The hired hands start to look at their employers differently. Noah James, Joseph Reinhardt, James Smith, Samuel Shoemaker, and young Jean-Baptiste Trudeau signed on to drive wagons to California, not to die in a mountain meadow. The comfortable distance between boss and worker begins to collapse when everyone faces the same enemy: cold, hunger, and the slow approach of death. Listen to the sounds of improvisation, canvas being stretched over improvised frames, ropes being tied and retied as the wind tests every knot, children being hushed when their play gets too loud, not from irritation but from the adult understanding that every calorie burned in unnecessary activity is a calorie that won't be available for survival later. The widow Wolfinger stays close to the Donner children, helping where she can. Her husband disappeared during the desert crossing, probably murdered by the Teamsters, leaving her alone with whatever gold they were carrying. Now gold seems less precious than firewood, and the Teamsters who might have killed her husband are dead themselves, claimed by disease or accident or the simple brutality of the trail. You notice how quickly social conventions disappear when survival is at stake. The careful manners and formal address that marked civilized interaction give way to the blunt efficiency of people who can't waste energy on politeness. Pass the axe. Bring more wood. Help me lift this. No please, no thank you, just the essential communication needed to stay alive. The shelters that rise from the snow look less like buildings and more like wounds in the landscape. Raw, ugly, desperate structures that speak to human determination and human limitations in equal measure. They'll keep the worst of the wind out maybe, and provide some protection from the snow, but they won't be warm, won't be comfortable, and won't offer much hope for long-term survival. As night falls, you gather around fires that seem pitifully small against the vast darkness of the mountains. The flames reflect off the snow, creating a circle of orange light that makes the wilderness beyond seem even blacker and more threatening. Someone produces a fiddle and plays a tune from back east, the melody thin and lonesome in the cold air. Then, music stops when everyone realizes it's making the children cry. Not from sadness, exactly, but from homesickness so profound it feels like physical pain. The tune reminds them of warm houses, full bellies, and the certainty that tomorrow would be better than today. None of those things exist anymore. You wrap yourself in whatever blankets and canvas you can find and try to sleep on ground that's frozen solid. The snow continues to fall, hissing softly as it hits the dying fire. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howls, the sound echoing off the granite walls like laughter. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new decisions about rationing food and conserving energy. Tomorrow will be one day closer to spring, but also one day deeper into winter. Tomorrow you'll wake up in a wilderness that doesn't care about your plans, your dreams, or your desperate need to stay alive. But that's tomorrow. Tonight, you listen to the snowfall and try not to think about how far you are from civilization, how long winter lasts in these mountains, or what happens when desperate people run out of food. December arrives like a creditor come to collect a debt you can't pay. You wake up in your crude shelter beside Truckee Lake to the sound of your own empty stomach growling, a noise that's become as common as the whistle of wind through the gaps in the cabin walls. The snow outside has deepened to several feet, transforming the landscape into something alien and hostile. Your breakfast consists of thin gruel made from flour and water, with perhaps a small piece of dried beef if you're lucky. The portions get smaller each day as the adults perform the grim arithmetic of survival. How many mouths? How much food? How many days until spring? The math never works out in your favour. You can hear the hollow sound of nearly empty food barrels being scraped for the last bits of sustenance. What once held pounds of salt pork now yields only a few scraps of rancid fat. The flour sacks that seemed so heavy back in Missouri now feel light as feathers when you lift them. Children ask for second helpings and are told there aren't any. Here's what hunger teaches you about time. It slows down. Minutes stretch into hours when your stomach is empty and your mind can think of nothing but food. You find yourself remembering meals from years ago with perfect clarity. The Sunday roast your mother used to make, the apple pie from the county fair, the simple pleasure of eating until you were satisfied, a luxury you never appreciated until it was gone. The sound of constant complaint fills the cabins, not whining exactly, but the low-level grumbling of bodies that aren't getting what they need. Joints ache from the cold and the hard sleeping surfaces. Muscles cramp from lack of proper nutrition. Tempers fray as easily as the worn fabric of clothing that's been patched and repatched until it's more patched than original material. Patrick Breen keeps a diary, one of the few sources that will survive to tell the story of these dark days. His entries grow shorter and more stark as conditions worsen. Snowed all night. Nothing to eat but ox hide. Mrs. Reed has nothing left but one hide. The simple statements carry the weight of slow-motion catastrophe. You watch the children grow thinner, their clothes hanging loose on frames that should be growing, but are instead shrinking. Their games become listless, lacking the energy that childhood should provide. They stop running and laughing, not from sadness, but from the simple biological imperative to conserve calories for basic survival. The oxen that brought you this far become potential food sources. Not yet, because they're still alive and might be needed if a rescue comes, or the snow melts enough to travel. But you find yourself looking at them differently, calculating how much meat they represent, how long that meat might last if rationed properly. Listen to the sound of adaptation. Bones being boiled and reboiled to extract every bit of nutrition. Leather being softened in hot water until it becomes something approaching edible. Tree bark being gathered and prepared, bitter and nearly indigestible but containing enough nutrients to keep you alive a little longer. The hierarchy of hunger establishes itself without formal discussion. The men get slightly larger portions because they are doing the heavy work of cutting wood and maintaining the shelters. The pregnant women get extra rations when possible. The children are fed first, even if it means the adults go without. These aren't laws, just the unspoken understanding of people trying to maintain their humanity while descending into desperation. Someone suggests sending a party on snowshoes to try to reach California and bring back help. It's a desperate plan, but desperation makes previously impossible ideas seem reasonable. 15 volunteers step forward, including some of the strongest men and women in the group. They'll call themselves the Forlorn Hope, a name that captures both their mission and their chances of success. The preparation for their departure reveals how little you really have left. The snowshoe party needs food for the journey, but there's barely enough food for those staying behind. Equipment has to be improvised from wagon parts and scraps of leather. Maps are sketchy at best, and no one is entirely sure which direction offers the best chance of reaching help. You help craft snowshoes from oxbows and rawhide awkward contraptions that might keep someone from sinking completely through the snow. The work keeps your hands busy, but your mind keeps wandering to darker thoughts. What happens if the snowshoe party doesn't make it? What happens if they do make it but help doesn't arrive in time? What happens when the last of the food runs out? The night before the Forlorn Hope departs, you gather around the fire and listen to Virginia Reed read from her prayer book. Her young voice wavers in the cold air as she recites familiar verses about deliverance and providence. The words that once brought comfort now seem to echo uselessly in the vast indifference of the mountains. December 16th. The Forlorn Hope disappears into the white wilderness, 15 tiny figures swallowed by the immensity of the Sierra Nevada. You watch until they're invisible, then keep watching the empty landscape as if staring hard enough might bring them back with supplies and rescue teams. But they're gone, and you're still here, trapped beside a frozen lake with winter tightening its grip like a vice. The food supplies continue to dwindle. The snow continues to fall, the children continue to grow thinner, and somewhere in the back of your mind an unthinkable thought begins to form. What happens when there's just nothing left to eat but each other? You don't voice this thought. No one does. But it hangs in the air like smoke from the fire, visible to everyone and acknowledged by no one. The final taboo, the ultimate survival strategy, the choice that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. For now, you boil another pot of hide soup and try not to think about tomorrow. January brings a different kind of cold, the bone-deep chill that seems to settle into your marrow and never leave. You wake up in the pre-dawn darkness to the sound of someone coughing, a wet rattling sound that speaks of lungs filling with fluid and bodies failing despite the mind's desperate will to continue. Bayliss Williams, one of the Reed family's hired hands, died 3 days before Christmas. He was the first, but everyone knew he wouldn't be the last. His body lies outside in the snow, frozen solid, waiting for the ground to thaw enough for burial, if the ground ever thaws. If any of you survive long enough to dig graves. The sound of death is quieter than you expected, not the dramatic gasping and final words of stories, but a gradual fading, like a candle burning down to nothing. Breathing becomes shallower, words become fewer, and then one morning someone simply doesn't wake up. Their suffering is over, yours continues. You're learning the hierarchy of mortality that starvation creates. The single men go first, their bodies having no reserves to draw upon after months of hard labour and insufficient food. Then the very old and the very young, those least able to generate the heat needed to survive the bitter mountain winter. The women and children hang on longer, their bodies more efficient at converting meagre calories into survival. Here's your historical fact about starvation. The human body can survive surprisingly long without food if water is available, but that survival comes at a cost. First, the body burns through its fat reserves, then begins consuming muscle tissue, then starts breaking down organs. Death comes not from hunger itself, but from the organ failure that follows prolonged malnutrition. Milton Elliot, another of the Reed's teamsters, dies on February 9th. He was young and strong when the journey began, but months of reduced rations and back-breaking labour have worn him down to nothing. His body joins Bayliss Williams in the snow outside, two monuments to the mathematics of survival that never work out in humanity's favour. The children start asking difficult questions. Why is Mr. Elliot sleeping outside in the snow? When will he wake up? Why won't he talk to them anymore? The adults struggle to explain death to minds too young to grasp the concept, but old enough to sense that something terrible is happening to their world. You can hear the sound of grief competing with the instinct for survival. There should be time to mourn, rituals to mark the passage of a human life, proper ceremonies to send the dead on their way. Instead, there's only the practical matter of what to do with bodies in ground too frozen to accept them, and the growing awareness that the dead might represent resources the living can't afford to waste. No one says it aloud. The word cannibalism doesn't appear in any of the diary entries or letters from this period, but you can see it in the glances exchanged over the fire, in the way conversations stop when children enter the room, in the careful way people avoid looking directly at the bodies lying in the snow. Mrs. Reed, whose husband was banished from the group months ago for killing another man in a dispute, faces the crisis alone with her 4 children. Her food supplies were among the first to run out. She boils leather and feeds it to her children, telling them it's meat. They're too hungry to question the lie, too young to understand the desperation behind their mother's calm voice. The Breen family, with 7 children to feed, starts showing the strain of collective starvation. The parents give their food to the children, refusing to eat until the youngest are fed. It's noble and heartbreaking and ultimately futile, because the mathematics of survival don't care about nobility or love or the bonds that hold families together. Listen to the sound of hope dying. It doesn't scream or sob or rage. It just gets quieter each day, like a voice calling from farther and farther away until you can't hear it anymore. The conversations about rescue missions and spring melts and making it to California fade into discussions about who might die next and what that might mean for the survivors. Someone suggests that if a rescue party does come, they should take the children first, get them out of the mountains and to safety, while the adults wait for a second rescue attempt. It's a rational plan that ignores the emotional reality of families being separated, possibly forever. Parents nod their agreement while holding their children closer. The snow continues to fall, adding to drifts that are now over the roofs of your crude shelters. You've become moles, burrowing through white tunnels to reach the outside world. The lake is frozen solid, covered with several feet of snow that makes it indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. The familiar world has been erased and replaced with something alien and hostile. You try to remember what warmth feels like, what it means to be truly full after a meal, what it's like to sleep without dreaming of food. These memories feel like stories someone told you about someone else's life. The person who started this journey back in Illinois, the one who believed in manifest destiny and golden opportunities, might as well have been someone else entirely. Another night falls, and you gather what little wood you can find to keep the fire burning. The flames provide light and heat, but more importantly, they provide the illusion that civilization still exists, that humanity hasn't completely surrendered to the wilderness. You stare into the coals and try not to think about the bodies outside, about the children growing thinner each day, about the unthinkable choice that's approaching with the inevitability of another snowstorm. Tomorrow someone else might die. Tomorrow the food might run out entirely. Tomorrow might be the day when the last taboo falls and survival becomes more important than the moral constraints that separate humans from animals. But that's tomorrow. Tonight, You feed another piece of wood to the fire and watch the sparks rise into the darkness like prayers. While you shiver beside Truckee Lake, 15 members of your party are fighting their own desperate battle for survival in the trackless wilderness of the Sierra Nevada. The Forlorn Hope, as they call themselves with grim humour, left on December 16th with minimal supplies and maximum determination. Now, over a month later, their story becomes a parallel nightmare to your own. They're walking on makeshift snowshoes across terrain that wants to kill them. The snow is 15 feet deep in places, soft enough to swallow a person who steps wrong, firm enough to support their weight if they distribute it properly. Every step is a gamble. Every mile forward costs more energy than their meagre rations can replace. You won't learn their story until later, but it's happening now, in real time, as you huddle in your cabin and wonder if help will ever come. 5 men, 10 women and children, led by a mix of desperation and hope, carrying barely enough food for a week on a journey that will take them a month if they're lucky. The sound of their passage is the crunch of snow under improvised snowshoes, the laboured breathing of people pushing their bodies beyond reasonable limits, the occasional crash when someone breaks through a snow bridge over a hidden creek. They move like ghosts across a landscape that seems designed to erase all traces of human presence. Here's what you don't know about their journey. On the 6th day, they run out of food entirely. Not low on supplies, not rationing carefully, but completely utterly out of anything resembling sustenance. They boil their snowshoe, leather and eat it. They chew on their own leather belts and shoe soles. They eat the few remaining coffee beans one at a time, trying to make them last. By December 25th, Christmas Day, they're faced with the choice that haunts your own nightmares. Antonio, one of the Mexican herders who joined the party, dies of starvation and exposure. His body lies in the snow and 15 starving people stare at it and make the calculation that will define the rest of their lives. They don't make the decision lightly or quickly. There are arguments, tears, prayers, and long silences filled with the sound of wind through pine trees. Some refuse entirely and say they'd rather die than cross that line. Others point out that death serves no one, that survival might allow them to bring help to those still trapped at the lake. Listen to the sound of humanity being redefined. It's not the savage gorging you might imagine. It's careful, methodical, ritualized. They treat the body with as much dignity as circumstances allow. They say prayers. They cook the meat thoroughly. They eat in silence, many of them weeping as they chew. The transformation isn't immediate or dramatic. They don't become monsters or lose their capacity for love and mercy. They remain recognisably human. Parents who worry about their children. Spouses who comfort each other. People who still dream of reaching California and starting new lives. They've simply adjusted their definition of what constitutes acceptable behaviour when survival is at stake. 4 more members of the Forlorn Hope will die during their journey. Each death becomes both a tragedy and a resource. The living mourn their companions and then make the practical decision to use their bodies to fuel the next stage of the journey. It's horrible and necessary and completely understandable once you accept the basic premise that staying alive matters more than preserving abstract moral principles. The 2 Indian guides, Luis and Salvador, begin to suspect that they might be killed for food rather than allowed to die naturally. They're probably right. The starving members of the party are beginning to look at each other with calculations that have nothing to do with friendship or shared hardship. They slip away from the group one night, choosing to die free rather than become someone else's meal. They don't make it far. Weak from starvation and exposure, they collapse in the snow and wait for death. When the main party finds them, they're still alive but barely conscious. 2 members of the Forlorn Hope shoot them, ending their suffering and adding to the group's food supply. It's murder, but it's also mercy, and in the context of the mountains, those distinctions become meaningless. By the time they stumble into a Miwok village in the foothills, only 7 members of the Forlorn Hope survive. They're skeletal, frostbitten, barely human in appearance. Their rescuers are horrified by their condition and appalled by their stories. But they organise a rescue mission because the alternative is leaving dozens of people to die beside a frozen lake. The news of their arrival spreads quickly through California. Newspapers pick up the story, and suddenly the Donner Party becomes a sensation. Not because of the suffering or the heroic efforts to survive, but because of the cannibalism. The word spreads like wildfire through a society that's simultaneously horrified and fascinated by the idea of civilized people eating human flesh. Back at the lake, you know none of this. You don't know that help is being organised, that your story is becoming newspaper headlines, that the world outside the mountains is debating the morality of survival at any cost. You only know that the Forlorn Hope disappeared into the wilderness over a month ago and hasn't returned. But rescue is coming. Slowly, hampered by weather and terrain and the simple logistics of organising an expedition into hostile mountains. The first relief party is already forming in the California settlements, gathering supplies and volunteers brave enough or foolish enough to risk their lives for strangers trapped in the snow. They'll arrive too late for some. The mathematics of starvation and exposure don't pause for rescue missions, but they'll arrive in time for others, carrying food and hope and the promise that the outside world hasn't forgotten about the emigrants trapped beside Truckee Lake. You don't know any of this as you settle down for another night of cold and hunger. You only know that the snow keeps falling, the food keeps running out, and the bodies outside keep multiplying. Tomorrow might bring death or rescue, or the unthinkable choice that the Forlorn Hope has already made. The fire burns low, and you add another piece of precious wood to keep it alive a little longer. February 15th, 1847. You wake up to the sound of absolute seawars, which in the mountains means either that a major storm is coming or that death has visited your camp again during the night. You push aside the canvas flap that serves as your door and step into a world that seems carved from marble, white and still and beautiful in a way that no longer brings you any comfort. Jacob Donner died 3 days ago. The quiet, reliable farmer who never complained about the hardships of the trail simply stopped breathing in his sleep, his body finally surrendering to the slow starvation that's been eating away at all of you. His corpse lies outside the Alder Creek shelters, frozen solid, waiting for ground soft enough to accept a grave. But the ground won't be soft for months, if ever, and the living can't afford to wait that long. You're learning things about desperation that no schoolbook ever taught, lessons written in empty stomachs and the hollow-eyed stares of children who've forgotten what it means to feel full. The moral absolutes that seemed so clear back in civilization become flexible when civilization itself is reduced to a few crude shelters and a handful of dying people. Here's what starvation does to your thinking. It clarifies priorities with brutal efficiency. The philosophical debates about right and wrong fade into background noise when your body is consuming its own muscle tissue to stay alive. The social conventions that separate humans from animals start to feel like luxuries you can't afford. Someone makes the first suggestion quietly, almost in whisper, as if speaking the words too loudly might summon divine judgment. What if the bodies outside could be used for food? They're already dead. They're frozen solid and naturally preserved by the mountain cold, and the living are dying slowly day by day, while potential sustenance lies just outside the cabin walls. The conversation stops there, but the idea doesn't die. It hangs in the air like smoke from the fire, visible to everyone and acknowledged by no one. Children are sent away when adults need to discuss certain topics. Conversations happen in languages the little ones don't understand or in coded references that preserve some shred of deniability. Listen to the sound of moral boundaries being negotiated. It's not dramatic or theatrical. It's a series of small compromises, gentle rationalizations, careful distinctions between what's acceptable and what's necessary. No one wants to be the first to cross the line, but everyone understands that the line is moving closer every day. Mrs. Reed, alone with her 4 children and no husband to make the difficult decisions, faces the choice that will define her character for history. Her youngest daughter is growing weaker by the day. Her sons are listless and hollow-eyed. She has boiled every piece of leather, gnawed every bone, scraped every barrel, until nothing remains but the stark mathematics of survival. The first meal happens without ceremony or ritual. A piece of meat prepared and cooked like any other, served to children who are too hungry to ask questions and too trusting to doubt their mother's judgment. It's not identified as human flesh, it's just protein sustenance, life measured in calories and distributed according to need. You want to judge them, these people who've crossed a line that seems absolute and inviolable. But you're hungry too. Your own children are growing thinner. Your own stomach gnaws at itself with increasing desperation. The moral clarity that seemed so obvious when you had enough to eat becomes muddy when faced with the simple choice between eating human flesh and watching your family starve. Here's your historical fact about survival cannibalism. It's been documented in every culture, every century, every extreme situation where humans face starvation. The Andes plane crash survivors, the sailors of the Essex, the siege of Leningrad. When the choice becomes eat the dead or join them, most people choose to eat. The physical act is less dramatic than you might imagine. The meat, when properly prepared, doesn't taste dramatically different from other proteins. The psychological impact is enormous, but the body accepts the nutrition gratefully. Strength returns gradually. Colour comes back to pale cheeks. The immediate crisis of starvation recedes, replaced by the longer-term crisis of living with what you've done. Not everyone makes the same choice. Some members of your group refuse entirely, preferring to die with their moral principles intact rather than live with the knowledge of what they've consumed. Their decision is brave and principled and completely understandable. It's also likely to be fatal. The children don't know. That's the agreement reached without formal discussion. The little ones are fed without being told what they're eating. They're protected from the knowledge that will burden the adults for the rest of their lives. It's both merciful and necessary, a conspiracy of silence born from love and desperation in equal measure. You find yourself looking at the other members of your party differently. Not with suspicion or fear, exactly, but with a new awareness of how thin the veneer of civilization really is. These are good people, decent folks who left comfortable lives in pursuit of a better future. They read the Bible, attend church, teach their children proper manners, and now they're eating human flesh to stay alive. The irony isn't lost on you that the same social bonds that made you willing to help these people survive are now part of what makes their survival possible. You're not eating strangers or enemies. You're eating friends, neighbours, people who shared the hardships of the trail and the hope of reaching California. The intimacy makes it worse and better simultaneously. Patrick Breen records the facts in his diary with characteristic understatement. Mrs. Reed has nothing left but one hide, and that is on Graves's shanty. Milt got his toes froze. The Donners told the California folks that they commenced to eat the dead people 4 days ago if they did not succeed that day or next in finding their cattle, then under 10 or 12 feet snow and did not know the spot or near it. I suppose they have done so at this time. The California folks he mentions are members of the first rescue party, finally arrived after weeks of preparation and dangerous travel through the mountains. They bring food, hope, and horror as they witness what survival has cost the people they came to save. But rescue brings its own complications. There's not enough food for everyone, not enough strong men to escort all the survivors back to safety. Difficult choices have to be made about who goes with the first relief and who stays behind to wait for additional help. Families are separated, possibly forever. Children are taken from parents who may not survive until the next rescue mission. You help load the pack animals with what little the survivors can carry. Personal possessions that seemed important back in Missouri now feel like meaningless weight. The only things that matter are food, warmth, and the faint hope that civilization still exists somewhere beyond these cursed mountains. As the first group of survivors disappears into the wilderness following the rescue party towards safety, you settle in to wait for the next relief mission. The food they left behind might last a week if rationed carefully. Their bodies outside will last longer, preserved by the cold and available when all other options are exhausted. You've crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. You've learned what you're capable of when survival is at stake. You've discovered that the moral principles you thought were absolute are actually negotiable when faced with the simple choice between eating the dead and joining them. The snow continues to fall, and the fire burns low, and tomorrow will bring new choices about what you're willing to do to stay alive. March 1st, 1847. You hear them before you see them, the sound of snowshoes crunching through the crust and voices calling out in English. The first human sounds from the outside world you've heard in months. The first rescue party has arrived, and with them comes the promise of salvation and the stark reality of what salvation actually looks like. 7 men, led by Aquila Glover and Daniel Rhodes, emerge from the white wilderness like figures from a dream. They were carrying packs loaded with beef jerky, flour and beans. Not enough to feed everyone, but enough to keep the weakest alive until more help can arrive. Their faces show the shock of what they're witnessing, the horror of discovering what the emigrants have become. The sound of relief is quieter than you expected. Not cheering or celebration, but soft crying and whispered prayers of gratitude. People who haven't seen outsiders in months suddenly remember what they look like through other eyes. hollow-cheeked, hollow-eyed, dressed in rags, speaking in the careful whispers of those who've learned to conserve every breath. Here's what you learn about rescue when you need it most. It's not a Hollywood ending with dramatic music and everyone saved at the last moment. It's a practical matter of limited supplies, dangerous conditions, and terrible choices about who can be saved immediately and who has to wait for help that might never come. The rescuers count the survivors and calculate carrying capacity. 23 people can attempt the journey to safety with this party. The rest will have to wait for the second relief, assuming a second relief can be organised, funded, and successfully guided through the mountains. The selection process is brutal in its efficiency. Children first, then women, then the men strong enough to help with the journey. Listen to the sound of families being torn apart. Mothers holding children who are strong enough to travel while babies too weak for the journey stay behind. Fathers saying goodbye to wives, not knowing if they'll ever see each other again. The practicalities of survival make emotional bonds seem like luxuries that can't be afforded. Virginia Reed, now 13 and wise beyond her years, helps organise the departure. Her mother and siblings will go with the first relief, but Virginia herself stays behind to help care for the younger children who aren't strong enough for the journey. It's a decision that shows remarkable maturity and courage, the kind of choice that defines character under extreme pressure. The Breen family faces an impossible decision. 7 children, 2 parents, and only enough resources for some of them to attempt escape. Patrick Breen makes the calculations that no parent should have to make, weighing the chances of survival for each child against the limited carrying capacity of the rescue party. You watch the first relief disappear into the white wilderness, carrying 23 survivors towards safety and leaving 36 people behind to wait for help that might not come. The extra supplies they've brought might last 2 weeks if carefully rationed. After that, you'll be back to boiling leather and making the unthinkable choices that have sustained you this far. The second rescue party arrives on March 1st, led by James Reed, who was banished from the group months ago for killing another emigrant in a dispute. Irony doesn't adequately describe his return as saviour to the people who exiled him. He brings more supplies and takes another group of survivors, but again, not everyone can go. Here's your historical fact about the rescue missions. 4 separate relief parties will eventually make the journey into the mountains, each facing the same terrible mathematics of limited supplies and unlimited need. Each party saves some lives and leaves others behind. Each journey is an act of remarkable courage by men who risk their own lives for strangers. Reed finds his wife and children safe in the first party, but the reunion is brief and complicated by the practical demands of survival. There's no time for emotional processing, no luxury of extended celebration. The mountains don't care about family reunions or dramatic reconciliations. They only care about wind and snow and the constant threat of another storm that could trap rescuers and rescued alike. The third relief arrives on March 17th, finding conditions at the lake camp even more desperate than before. Bodies that were preserved by the cold have been used for sustenance. The moral boundaries that seemed absolute back in civilization have been thoroughly erased by the simple mathematics of survival. Some of the rescuers are shocked by what they discover. Letters and diary entries describe their horror at finding evidence of cannibalism, their struggle to understand how civilized people could cross such lines. Others are more pragmatic, recognizing that survival sometimes requires choices that comfortable people can't imagine making. The final rescue party, led by William Fallon, arrives in April to find only one survivor remaining at the lake camp, Louis Kesselberg, the German immigrant who was among the last to be saved. His survival story becomes the most controversial aspect of the entire tragedy, with accusations of murder and cannibalism that will follow him for the rest of his life. You're part of the third relief, weak but alive, carried out of the mountains on a makeshift stretcher because you're too starved to walk. The journey to safety is a blur of snow and exhaustion, punctuated by moments of clarity when you realise you're actually going to survive, that the mountains haven't claimed you after all. The descent from the high country feels like resurrection. Each mile brings you closer to green grass, running water, and the promise of abundant food. The air gets thicker and easier to breathe. The snow gives way to mud, then to bare ground, then to the first tentative signs of spring. But survival comes with its own burden. You carry the knowledge of what you've done, what you've seen, what you've been forced to become in order to stay alive. The person who entered the mountains last autumn died there, replaced by someone harder, more pragmatic, forever changed by the experience of absolute desperation. The world you return to is fascinated by your story but horrified by its details. Newspapers sensationalize the cannibalism while largely ignoring the courage, determination, and simple human decency that allowed any of you to survive. You become famous for the worst reasons, known for what you ate rather than what you endured. 48 members of the Donner Party survive the ordeal. 39 die in the mountains, claimed by starvation, exposure, and the simple brutality of a landscape that doesn't care about human dreams or human suffering. The survivors carry physical and emotional scars that will never fully heal, along with stories that will become legend. You're alive, but at a cost that can't be calculated in dollars or measured in miles. You've learned what you're capable of when everything else is stripped away. You've discovered that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than you ever imagined, and that crossing it is easier than you ever wanted to know. April 10th, 1847. You stumble down the western slope of the Sierra Nevada, supported by rescuers who marvel that you're still breathing after everything you've endured. The spring air tastes like freedom, warm and thick with the scent of growing things. Behind you, the mountains still gleam with snow, beautiful and terrible and forever marked in your memory, as the place where you learned what human beings are truly capable of. Your body weighs 60 pounds less than when you entered the mountains. Your clothes hang on your frame like fabric draped over a scarecrow. Your hands shake constantly from malnutrition and nervous exhaustion. But you're alive, which is more than can be said for 41 members of your party who remain buried under the Sierra Nevada snow. The psychological weight is harder to measure than the physical damage. You carry memories that civilized society isn't equipped to understand or absorb. The taste of human flesh, the sound of children crying from hunger, the terrible calm that settles over people when they've accepted that they're going to die. These memories don't fade with time or distance, they become part of who you are. Here's what survival costs when it requires crossing moral boundaries. It's not just the act itself, but the knowledge that you are capable of it. The comfortable assumptions about human nature, about your own character, about the absolute nature of right and wrong, all of that gets stripped away like bark from a tree, leaving something raw and vulnerable underneath. The world you return to is simultaneously fascinated and repelled by your story. Newspapers compete to publish the most sensational accounts, focusing on the cannibalism while ignoring the complex human story of people trying to maintain their humanity under impossible circumstances. You become a curiosity, a cautionary tale, a symbol of how quickly civilization can collapse when faced with genuine crisis. Listen to the sound of judgment in the voices of people who've never missed a meal, never faced the choice between eating human flesh and watching their children starve. They use words like savage and inhuman while eating their comfortable dinners in warm houses, protected by the very civilization that failed you when you needed it most. Some of the survivors handle the burden better than others. Virginia Reed grows up to write eloquent letters about the experience, finding meaning in suffering and wisdom in survival. Others, like Louis Keseberg, are haunted by accusations and suspicions that follow them for the rest of their lives. The German immigrant who survived longer than anyone else at the lake camp becomes a scapegoat for the group's collective guilt about what they had to do to stay alive. The children who survived carry their own unique burden. Most were too young to understand what was happening at the time, but old enough to retain fractured memories that will surface in dreams and nightmares for decades to come. They grow up knowing they ate human flesh without understanding the moral weight of that knowledge. Tamsin Donner becomes a figure of tragic nobility in the popular imagination, the schoolteacher who chose to stay with her dying husband rather than save herself. But the real story is more complex, involving difficult calculations about who had the best chance of survival and who could be sacrificed for the greater good of the group. You settle in California's Central Valley, trying to build the new life you originally came west to find. The land is everything the promotional materials promised, fertile, temperate, abundant with opportunity, but the golden dream feels tarnished, now paid for with a price that retrospectively seems too high. The milk and honey taste different when you remember what you ate to survive long enough to taste them. The nightmares come regularly. Not dramatic, screaming affairs, but quiet dreams where you're back in the mountains, cold and hungry, making choices no human being should have to make. You wake up checking your hands for blood that isn't there, listening for wind through pine trees that grow 100 miles away. Some survivors find solace in religion, interpreting their ordeal as a test of faith that they passed by staying alive. Others lose their faith entirely, unable to reconcile the existence of a benevolent God with the suffering they endured and witnessed. Most fall somewhere in between, their relationship with the divine complicated by experiences that don't fit into comfortable theological frameworks. Here's your historical fact about the long-term impact of survival cannibalism. Studies of other cases, from the Andes plane crash to Arctic expeditions, show that survivors typically experience guilt, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms for years or decades after the event. The psychological cost of crossing that ultimate taboo doesn't end when the physical danger passes. The Donner Party story becomes a permanent part of American folklore, but the version that enters popular culture is simplified and sensationalized. The complex reality of people trying to maintain their humanity while doing inhuman things gets reduced to a simple morality tale about the dangers of taking shortcuts or the thin veneer of civilization. You find yourself avoiding social gatherings where the conversation might turn to your experiences. When people learn your name, their eyes light up with morbid curiosity, and you know they're thinking about cannibalism rather than courage, about sensational headlines rather than the simple fact that you endured something most people couldn't survive. The other survivors become your only real community, the only people who understand the weight you carry. You correspond occasionally, carefully avoiding the topics that bind you together, while finding comfort in shared understanding. They're the only ones who know that survival sometimes requires becoming someone you never imagined you could be. Years pass, then decades. The story gets retold and embellished, mythologized and moralized, turned into cautionary tales and adventure stories. But for you, it remains simply what happened that during the winter, when the snow trapped your party in the mountains and tested everything you thought you knew about yourself. The mountains are still there, of course, their granite peaks gleaming with snow that looks beautiful from a distance. Highways now cross the passes that nearly killed you. Tourists drive through in air-conditioned comfort, many of them unaware of the tragedy that unfolded in these very locations. The landscape that tried to erase you has been conquered by engineering and technology, made safe for people who will never face the choices you faced, but you remember. You carry the knowledge of what those mountains cost, what they taught, what they took from the people who dared to cross them with insufficient preparation and too much confidence in their own invincibility. You survived, but the person who entered those mountains died there, replaced by someone harder, wiser, and forever changed by the experience of ultimate desperation. The taste of human flesh fades from memory, but the knowledge that you are capable of eating it never does. May 18th, 47. You stand on the front porch of a house in the Sacramento Valley, looking east toward the Sierra Nevada mountains that nearly claimed your life. The peaks gleam white in the distance, beautiful and serene, giving no hint of the horrors they conceal. Your host, a kind settler who's taken in several Donner Party survivors, brings you a plate of food that contains more nutrition than you consumed in some entire weeks during the winter ordeal. The abundance feels surreal after months of calculating calories and measuring survival in spoonfuls of gruel. Fresh bread still warm from the oven. Butter churned that morning from cream so rich it coats your tongue. Vegetables from a garden where growth happens naturally, without desperate human intervention. You eat slowly, savouring flavours you'd forgotten existed, but your stomach, shrunken by starvation, can only handle small portions. Your body is healing, adding weight gradually as regular meals restore what the mountains took away. But the psychological adjustments prove more difficult than the physical recovery. Civilization feels overwhelming after months of existence reduced to the basic necessities of shelter, warmth, and food. The complexity of normal social interaction, polite conversation, concern for appearances, the luxury of discussing topics beyond immediate survival requires conscious effort to navigate. Here's what you discover about returning to a world that never stopped turning while you fought for your life. People want to hear your story, but only certain versions of it. They're fascinated by the adventure, the hardship, the drama of rescue. But they're uncomfortable with the moral complexities, the psychological toll, the simple fact that survival sometimes requires becoming someone you never thought you could be. The newspapers have already gotten hold of the story, and their versions bear little resemblance to the complex reality you lived through. Sensational headlines scream about cannibalism and savagery, turning your group into cautionary tales about the dangers of westward expansion and the thin veneer of civilization. The reporters want clear villains and heroes, simple moral lessons, dramatic quotes that will sell papers to readers eating comfortable breakfasts in warm houses. You find yourself editing your memories when people ask about the experience, not lying exactly, but choosing which truths to share and which to keep locked away. The children who ate human flesh without knowing it, that stays private. The calculations about which bodies to use first, that's not for public consumption. The quiet moments when you considered giving up entirely, those belong to you alone. Listen to the sound of judgment in voices that have never faced genuine desperation. Church leaders preach sermons about maintaining moral standards under adversity, using your experience as an example while carefully avoiding the specific details of what those standards cost. Politicians debate the implications for westward expansion, wondering if the California dream is worth the price some people pay to achieve it. The children adapt more quickly than the adults, their young minds more flexible in processing trauma and moving forward. Virginia Reed writes letters to relatives back in Illinois, describing California's beauty and opportunity while carefully omitting the worst details of how she got here. Her famous advice, never take no cut-offs and hurry along as fast as you can, becomes a simple summary of a complex tragedy. But other survivors struggle with the transition. Louis Keseberg, the last man rescued from the lake camp, faces accusations of murder and cannibalism that follow him wherever he goes. The fact that he survived longer than anyone else, he was found alone among evidence of human consumption, makes him a convenient scapegoat for the group's collective guilt about what they had to do to stay alive. You attend a memorial service for the 41 members of your party who didn't survive the mountains. The minister speaks about God's plan and the mysterious ways of providence, words that feel hollow to someone who watched children starve while their parents boiled leather for soup. The comfort that religion offers to those who haven't faced ultimate desperation doesn't extend to those who have. The social dynamics among survivors prove complicated. You're bound together by shared experience that no one else can understand, but you're also reminders to each other of the worst moments of your lives. Some friendships deepen through mutual understanding, others dissolve because the people involved can't separate each other from the memories they'd rather forget. Here's your historical fact about survivor communities. People who've endured extreme trauma together often maintain lifelong connections, but those connections are complicated by the knowledge they share. The bonds forged in crisis don't always translate into comfortable peacetime relationships. You start receiving letters from back east, from relatives and friends who've read newspaper accounts of your ordeal. They express relief at your survival, but their words carry undertones of curiosity and judgment. They want to know if the stories are true, if you really did what the papers say you did. Their questions force you to relive experiences you're trying to process and move beyond. Some survivors choose to move away, to places where their names aren't associated with cannibalism and tragedy. They reinvent themselves, create new identities, try to escape the weight of their history. Others stay in California, helping to build the communities they came to join, finding meaning in the fact that their suffering wasn't entirely meaningless if it contributed to something larger than themselves. The practical matter of rebuilding your life proves challenging in ways you didn't anticipate. Jobs are available, but employers sometimes have reservations about hiring someone whose name they recognize from sensational newspaper stories. Social invitations come with the uncomfortable awareness that you're being invited as much for your notoriety as for your company. You find work with a farmer who needs experienced hands and doesn't ask too many questions about your past. The labour feels good after months of enforced inactivity, and the routine of planting and tending and harvesting provides structure for days that might otherwise be consumed by memory and regret. The soil is rich and responsive, yielding crops that seem miraculous to someone who spent a winter eating boiled leather. But even in the fields, working under the California sun, and the mountains remain visible on the eastern horizon. You glance at them unconsciously throughout the day, checking to see if they're still there, still gleaming with snow that looks beautiful from a distance. They've become part of your internal landscape, a permanent reminder of what you survived and what it cost. The nights are when the memories press closest, not dramatic nightmares, but quiet dreams where you're back in the crude shelters beside Truckee Lake, cold and hungry, making choices no civilization person should have to make. You wake up checking your hands for blood that isn't there, listening for wind through pine trees that grow 100 miles away. October 1847, exactly 1 year after you were trapped by the early Sierra Nevada snowfall. You're sitting in a San Francisco newspaper office, watching a reporter scribble notes as you try to explain what really happened during those months beside Truckee Lake. But you can already see the gap between what you're saying and what he's hearing, between the complex truth of survival and the simple story his readers want to consume with their morning coffee. The Donner Party has become a sensation, the kind of story that spreads through 19th century America like wildfire through dry grass. Every newspaper wants to print its own version, each one more sensational than the last. The facts get embellished, the timeline compressed, the moral complexity is reduced to simple lessons about the dangers of taking shortcuts and the thin veneer of civilization. You watch your experience being transformed into entertainment, your suffering, monetized for the consumption of people who've never missed a meal. The reporters focus on the cannibalism because it sells papers, while ignoring the courage, determination, and basic human decency that allowed any of you to survive. You become famous for what you ate rather than what you endured. Here's how legends are born from tragedy. The messy, complicated reality gets simplified into digestible narratives that fit pre-existing moral frameworks. Heroes and villains are identified, lessons are extracted, and the human complexity that made the whole situation tragic gets lost in the desire for clear meaning and simple justice. Louis Kesselberg becomes the primary villain in most accounts, the German immigrant whose survival makes him convenient to blame for the group's darkest actions, never mind that he showed remarkable endurance and probably saved other lives by staying alive longer than anyone else at the lake camp. His foreign accent and different customs make him an easy target for a society that wants someone to carry the moral weight of what everyone had to do. Tamsin Donner becomes the tragic heroine, the schoolteacher who chose love over survival, staying with her dying husband rather than escaping to safety. The reality that she made practical calculations about who could best survive the journey out of the mountains gets lost in the romantic narrative of noble self-sacrifice. She becomes a symbol of feminine virtue, which says more about 19th century gender expectations than about the actual choices she faced. Listen to the sound of mythology being manufactured. Dramatic quotes that were never spoken get attributed to various survivors. Heroic actions that happen to some get transferred to others. The chronology gets rearranged to create better narrative flow. The story becomes more important than the truth, and the truth becomes whatever serves the story. Children's textbooks begin including simplified versions of the Donner Party tale as cautionary examples of poor planning and moral failure. Fourth graders across America learn that taking shortcuts is dangerous and that civilized people should never resort to cannibalism. Lessons that completely miss the point of what you actually experienced. The complex reality gets reduced to moral instruction for 8-year-olds. You correspond with other survivors, sharing letters that carefully avoid the topics that bind you together, while finding comfort in shared understanding. Virginia Reed writes eloquent letters about California's opportunities while diplomatically omitting the worst details. Patrick Breen's diary becomes a historical document, but even his understated entries get interpreted through this lens of sensationalism. Some survivors embrace the fame, lecturing about their experiences to audiences hungry for adventure stories safely distant from their own comfortable lives. Others retreat into anonymity, changing their names and moving to places where their history won't follow them. Most fall somewhere between, learning to live with notoriety they never sought and didn't want. The scientific community begins studying the Donner Party as an example of human behavior under extreme stress. Doctors want to understand the physiology of starvation. Anthropologists examine the social dynamics of survival situations. Psychologists explore the mental processes that allow people to cross moral boundaries when faced with death. You become a case study rather than a human being. Here's what happens when your private trauma becomes public entertainment. The ownership of your story shifts from you to society. Reporters, historians, novelists, and eventually filmmakers feel entitled to interpret your experience for their own purposes. Your agency over your own narrative disappears into the larger cultural need for meaning and moral instruction. The religious community splits over the theological implications of your survival choices. Some ministers preach about maintaining faith under adversity, using the survivors as examples of God's protection. Others focus on the moral failures, arguing that true Christians would choose death over dishonor. Both interpretations miss the reality of people trying to maintain their humanity while doing whatever was necessary to stay alive. Academic historians begin the process of creating an official version of events, collecting documents and interviewing survivors to establish facts. But facts prove slippery when filtered through memory, trauma, and the human tendency to reshape experience into manageable narratives. The historical record becomes as much about what people want to believe happened as what actually occurred. You find yourself becoming protective of the other survivors, especially the children who grew up bearing the weight of decisions they were too young to make. When newspapers publish sensational accounts that name specific individuals, you write letters to editors demanding accuracy and respect for people who have already suffered enough. Sometimes they publish your corrections, usually they don't. The phrase Donner Party enters the American vocabulary as shorthand for cannibalism, desperation, and the failure of westward expansion dreams. It becomes a punchline in some contexts, a cautionary tale in others, always reduced to its most sensational elements. The complexity of human beings trying to survive impossible circumstances gets lost in the need for simple moral lessons. Years pass and new tragedies capture public attention. Your story fades from the front pages, but never entirely disappears. It becomes part of American folklore, told and retold in countless versions, each one shaped by the values and concerns of the society doing the telling. You become mythological figures rather than historical people. But you remember the truth, even as it becomes increasingly difficult to separate your actual memories from the versions that have been created by others. The person who experienced those months beside Truckee Lake still exists inside you, carrying knowledge that can't be reduced to moral lessons or entertainment. That person knows what you're really capable of when everything else is stripped away. The mountains remain on the eastern horizon, beautiful and terrible, indifferent to the stories told about what happened in their shadows. December 1853, 6 years after your rescue from the Sierra Nevada mountains, you're standing in a cemetery in San Jose, California, attending the funeral of another Donner Party survivor who couldn't carry the weight of memory any longer. The minister speaks about rest and peace and the end of earthly suffering, words that might comfort those who haven't learned what you know about the true nature of human suffering. The suicide rate among survivors is higher than anyone wants to acknowledge publicly. The newspapers that sensationalized your story have no interest in reporting the long-term psychological cost of what they turned into entertainment. But you know the truth. Some people survive the mountains only to be killed by the memories of what they had to do to stay alive. Your own nights are haunted by dreams that never quite fade into the comfortable distance of the past. Not dramatic nightmares of screaming and blood, but quiet dreams where you're back beside the frozen lake, cold and hungry, making calculations about which body to use first. You wake up checking your hands for stains that aren't there, listening for wind through pine trees that grow 100 miles away. Here's what carrying traumatic memory feels like 6 years after the fact. It's not a burden you can set down or a wound that heals cleanly. It's woven into the fabric of who you are, influencing every decision, colouring every experience, shaping every relationship. The person who entered those mountains died there, replaced by someone who knows things comfortable. People never learn. The children who survive carry their own unique burden. Most were too young to understand what was happening at the time, but old enough to retain fractured memories that surface in unexpected moments. They grow up knowing they ate human flesh without fully comprehending the moral weight of that knowledge until they're old enough for it to destroy them. You maintain correspondence with other survivors, letters that dance carefully around the experiences that bind you together. Virginia Reed has married and started a family, finding strength in the conventional roles that society expects of women. But her letters contain hints of the steel, forged in the mountains, the quiet competence of someone who's faced genuine crisis and survived. Louis Keseberg has moved north to Oregon, trying to escape the accusations and suspicions that follow him wherever his name is known. He runs a small business and keeps to himself, but the whispers follow him anyway. The man who survived, longest at the lake camp, becomes a permanent scapegoat for the group's collective guilt about what they had to do. Listen to the sound of trauma echoing through generations. The survivors' children grow up in households where certain topics are never discussed, where their parents' past remains mysteriously off-limits. They sense the weight their parents carry without understanding its source, inheriting anxiety and hypervigilance they can't explain. Some survivors find meaning in their experience, becoming advocates for better trail conditions, improved rescue capabilities, or simply the importance of adequate preparation before attempting dangerous journeys. They transform their suffering into something useful, finding purpose in preventing others from facing similar ordeals. Others retreat into alcohol, religion, or geographic isolation, seeking escape from memories that provide no relief. The laudanum that was meant to treat physical injuries becomes a way to numb psychological pain that has no clear remedy. Some survivors become dependent on the substances that offer temporary respite from permanent damage. You've learnt to function in society, but the integration feels incomplete, like wearing clothes that don't quite fit. The social conventions that matter to other people, fashion, gossip, political debates, that don't involve life and death consequences, feel trivial compared to the fundamental questions about human nature that the mountains forced you to confront. The business of daily life continues around you, but you remain partially detached from it, an observer more than a participant. You go through the motions of normal existence while carrying knowledge that sets you apart from people who've never had to choose between moral principles and physical survival. Here's your historical fact about long-term trauma survival. Modern psychology recognizes what 19th century society couldn't acknowledge, that extreme experiences permanently alter brain structure and function. The hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and intrusive memories that plague many survivors are physiological responses to psychological injury, not moral failures or character weaknesses. You find unexpected comfort in the company of veterans from the Mexican-American War, men who've seen combat and understand what it means to carry experiences that polite society can't process. They don't ask for details about what happened in the mountains, and you don't press them for war stories. The mutual understanding exists without need for explanation. The weather affects you differently now. Winter storms that other people view as inconveniences trigger anxiety responses that take days to subside. Snow is no longer beautiful or peaceful, but a reminder of what cold can do to human bodies, how quickly comfortable circumstances can become life-threatening disasters. You've developed an unconscious habit of assessing every meal in terms of calories and survival value, calculating how long the food would last if other sources weren't available. The abundance of California agriculture should be reassuring, but instead it highlights the randomness to fortune, how easily plenty can become scarcity. The mountains remain visible on the eastern horizon, their snow-covered peaks gleaming in the distance like monuments to experiences most people can't imagine. Highways now cross the passes that nearly killed you, and tourists travel through in comfort, many unaware of the tragedy that unfolded in these locations. The landscape that tried to erase you has been conquered by engineering and technology, but you remember. You carry the knowledge of what those mountains cost, what they taught, what they took from people who dared to cross them with insufficient preparation and too much confidence in human resilience. The story has become legend, simplified and sanitized for public consumption, but you live the complex reality. Some nights you dream of the people who didn't make it out, the 41 members of your party who remain buried under Sierra Nevada snow. They appear in your sleep not as accusers or ghosts, but as companions who understood what you were all facing together. In the dreams, they're not angry about being eaten. They're grateful that their sacrifice allowed someone to survive, to remember, to carry the story forward. You wake from these dreams not with horror, but with a strange sense of peace, as if the dead have given you permission to continue living despite what living required. The guilt remains, but alongside it grows something that might eventually become wisdom, the understanding that survival sometimes demands becoming someone you never imagined you could be, and that carrying that knowledge is both burden and gift. The taste of human flesh faded from memory years ago, but the knowledge that you are capable of eating it never will. It remains part of who you are, a fundamental truth about human nature that most people never have to confront. You survive the mountains, but the mountains also live in you, a permanent reminder of what lies beneath the comfortable surface of civilization. September 1858, 11 years after your rescue from the Sierra Nevada. You're standing in a schoolhouse in Sacramento watching a teacher point to a crude map of the western United States while explaining to a classroom full of 8-year-olds why taking shortcuts on the trail west is dangerous. Your name comes up as an example of poor decision-making, your experience reduced to a simple moral lesson about the importance of following established routes. The children listen wide-eyed as their teacher describes the savage cannibalism that occurred when your party was trapped by snow. They don't understand the complex reality of people trying to maintain their humanity while doing whatever was necessary to survive. They only hear a cautionary tale about what happens to travellers who make bad choices and don't trust in proper planning and divine providence. This is what your story has become in the American imagination, a simplified morality play about the dangers of ambition, the thin veneer of civilization, and the importance of following traditional paths rather than seeking shortcuts to success. The messy human reality gets lost in the need for clear lessons that fit comfortably into textbooks and sermons. Here's how tragedy becomes mythology in a society hungry for simple truths. The complex circumstances that led to your desperate choices get reduced to a series of moral failings. Taking the Hastings Cutoff becomes evidence of greed and impatience rather than a reasonable decision based on available information. The cannibalism becomes proof of savage instincts lurking beneath civilized exteriors rather than the logical endpoint of systematic starvation. You've become a stock character in American folklore, the cautionary figure whose suffering serves to instruct others about proper behaviour and moral boundaries. Your name appears in sermons about maintaining faith under adversity, in political speeches about the importance of traditional values, in adventure stories designed to thrill children while teaching them about the consequences of poor judgment. The irony isn't lost on you that the society that judges your survival choices is the same one that celebrated the California Gold Rush, the Mexican-American War, and the doctrine of manifest destiny. The appetite for expansion and conquest that drew you west in the first place now condemns the methods you used to survive when that expansion went wrong. Listen to the sound of your experience being co-opted by people who weren't there, used to support arguments you never made and moral positions you don't necessarily hold. Religious leaders use your story to argue for the importance of maintaining Christian values under adversity, conveniently ignoring the fact that survival sometimes requires flexibility and moral thinking. Politicians invoke the Donner Party as evidence that westward expansion should be more carefully managed, better funded, and properly supervised by government authorities. They use your suffering to justify increased federal involvement in a territorial development, while completely missing the point that individual preparation and group cooperation might have made more difference than bureaucratic oversight. The entertainment industry has discovered your story as source material for novels, stage plays, and eventually the moving pictures that are beginning to capture America's imagination. Each adaptation focuses on the most sensational elements, while ignoring the psychological complexity and moral ambiguity that made the situation truly tragic. Here's what happens when your private trauma becomes public property. Artists, writers, and performers feel entitled to interpret your experience for their own purposes, creating versions that serve their artistic vision rather than historical accuracy. Your agency over your own narrative disappears into the larger cultural need for meaning and moral instruction. Some survivors have learned to profit from the fame, charging admission for lectures about their experiences and selling their stories to publishers hungry for adventure tales. Others retreat into anonymity, changing their names and moving to places where their history won't follow them. You fall somewhere between, neither embracing nor entirely rejecting the notoriety that circumstance thrust upon you. The children who survive the ordeal grow up bearing the weight of decisions they were too young to make or understand. They face classmates who've heard simplified versions of the story and form judgments about their families based on newspaper accounts and textbook summaries. Some embrace their history, others try to escape it, but none can avoid it entirely. You receive regular correspondence from historians, journalists, and curiosity seekers who want to interview you about the experience. Their questions reveal how the story has been distorted through repeated telling. They ask about dramatic confrontations that never happened, heroic speeches that were never made, moral dilemmas that were resolved with less anguish than the popular versions suggest. The process of being interviewed forces you to relive experiences you're trying to process and move beyond. Each retelling requires emotional energy you're not sure you can spare, and the knowledge that your words will be filtered through other people's agendas makes you increasingly reluctant to share the details that might actually matter. Academic historians begin the process of creating an official version of events, collecting documents and testimonies to establish what they call the historical record. But records prove slippery when filtered through memory, trauma, and the human tendency to reshape experience into manageable narratives. The legal system occasionally intrudes as descendants of party members argue over property rights, inheritance claims, and the reputation of family members who died in the mountains. Your testimony becomes evidence in disputes that have nothing to do with survival and everything to do with money, land, and social standing. You find yourself becoming protective of the other survivors, particularly those like Louis Keseberg, who've become convenient scapegoats for the group's collective actions. When newspapers publish accusations of murder, or especially heinous acts of cannibalism, you write letters to editors demanding accuracy and fairness for people who have already suffered enough. The phrase Donner Party enters the American vocabulary as shorthand for desperation, cannibalism, and the failure of American dreams. It appears in political cartoons, newspaper editorials, and casual conversation as a reference point for any situation involving difficult choices or moral compromise. Your name becomes a metaphor rather than a marker of individual human experience. Years pass and new tragedies capture public attention, but your story never entirely fades from national consciousness. It becomes embedded in American culture as a permanent reminder of what can happen when civilization meets wilderness, when human ambition exceeds human preparation, when the promise of California gold encounters the reality of Sierra Nevada snow. But you remember the truth, even as it becomes increasingly difficult to separate your actual memories from the versions created by others. The person who experienced those months beside Truckee Lake still exists inside you, carrying knowledge that can't be reduced to moral lessons or entertainment value. March 1865, 18 years after your rescue. You're reading newspaper accounts of the Civil War's end while sitting on the porch of your small ranch in California's Central Valley. The country has just survived its own desperate winter, 4 years of brother fighting. Brother, and the moral complexities that seemed so clear-cut in peacetime proved just as murky when survival was at stake. You wonder if the soldiers who lived through Andersonville or Gettysburg understand something about human nature that comfortable civilians will never grasp. The other Donner Party survivors have scattered across the continent like seeds from a dandelion, each finding their own way to live with memories that won't fade and fame they never sought. Some have thrived despite their notoriety, building successful businesses and raising families who carry forward the legacy of survival. Others have been crushed by the weight of what they experienced and what the world made of their experience. Virginia Reed, now Virginia Reed Murphy, has become the most eloquent spokesperson for the survivors. Her famous letter advising future emigrants to never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can gets quoted in newspapers across the country. She's learned to tell her story in ways that emphasize perseverance and faith rather than the darker details that haunt private memory. But you know from her occasional letters that the public version of her experience isn't the complete story. She still wakes up sometimes checking her hands for blood that isn't there, still calculates the caloric value of meals automatically, still feels the phantom cold of Sierra Nevada winters when storm clouds gather. The competent woman who built a successful life in California carries inside her the frightened child who ate human flesh to stay alive. Louis Keseberg has moved to Oregon, then to Northern California, trying to stay ahead of the accusations and suspicions that follow wherever his name is known. He's built and lost several businesses, married and raised children, worked as everything from a restaurateur to a brewer. But the whispers follow him, the man who survived longest at the lake camp and therefore must bear the moral weight of everyone's survival choices. Here's what you've learned about carrying historical notoriety. It follows you across state lines and through career changes, shapes how people react to your name and influences opportunities you'll never even know you lost. Your children inherit it along with their family name, growing up with playground taunts about their cannibal grandfather and classmates who've heard simplified versions of complex truth. Patrick Breen, whose diary provided one of the few contemporary records of the ordeal, died in 1868 without ever fully escaping the association with cannibalism and desperation. His straightforward, understated entries about daily life during the winter became historical documents, but even his careful language gets interpreted through the lens of sensationalism. Some survivors have found meaning by transforming their experience into service to others. They become advocates for better trail conditions, improved rescue capabilities, or simply the importance of adequate preparation before attempting dangerous journeys. Their suffering becomes purposeful when it prevents others from facing similar ordeals. Others retreat into alcohol, religion, or geographic isolation, seeking escape from memories that provide no relief. The medications that were meant to treat physical injuries become ways to numb psychological pain that has no clear remedy. Some survivors become dependent on substances that offer a temporary respite from permanent damage. Listen to the sound of trauma echoing through generations. The survivors' children grow up in households where certain topics are never discussed, where their parents' past remains mysteriously off-limits. They inherit anxiety and hypervigilance they can't explain, behavioural patterns shaped by experiences they never shared. You've maintained correspondence with other survivors over the years, letters that dance carefully around the experiences that bind you together while finding comfort in shared understanding. The conversations happen in code, references to the winter or the mountains, that carry freight no outsider could decode. The children who survived the ordeal have grown into adults who carry their own unique burden. Most were too young to understand what was happening at the time, but old enough to retain fractured memories that surface at unexpected moments. They learned about their own history from newspaper accounts and textbook summaries, discovering the details of their childhood through the filter of public judgment. Some have embraced their legacy, becoming successful business people who use their notoriety as a form of social capital. Others have changed their names and moved to places where their family history won't follow them. Most fall somewhere between, learning to live with fame they never sought and didn't want while building lives that transcend their childhood trauma. The business of daily life continues around all of you, but the integration feels incomplete, like wearing clothes that don't quite fit properly. Social conventions that matter to other people feel trivial compared to the fundamental questions about human nature that the mountains forced you to confront. Here's your historical fact about long-term survival psychology: the hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and intrusive memories that plague many survivors are normal responses to abnormal experiences. What 19th century society interpreted as moral weakness or character failure, modern psychology recognizes as predictable consequences of extreme trauma. You've found unexpected solidarity with veterans of America's various wars, men who've seen combat and understand what it means to carry experiences that polite society can't process. They don't ask for details about what happened in the mountains, and you don't press them for war stories. The mutual understanding exists without need for explanation. The mountains remain visible on the eastern horizon, their snow-covered peaks gleaming in the distance like monuments to experiences most people can't imagine. Railroads now cross the passes that nearly killed you, and tourists travel through in comfort, many unaware of the tragedy that unfolded in these locations. Some survivors make pilgrimages back to the sites where they nearly died, seeking closure or understanding or simply the confirmation that they really did survive something extraordinary. Others never return, preferring to keep the mountains as memories rather than risking the confrontation with physical reality. The story continues to evolve in popular culture, each new version reflecting the values and concerns of the society doing the telling. What began as a tale of Western adventure becomes a meditation on American ambition, then a study in survival psychology, then entertainment for people seeking vicarious thrills. But you remember the complex human reality that underlies all the simplified versions. The love that motivated parents to feed their children without asking what they were eating. The cooperation that allowed strangers to become family when family members died. The basic decency that survived even when civilization didn't. October 1876, 29 years after your rescue from the Sierra Nevada mountains. You're sitting in your parlor in San Jose, California, reading yet another newspaper account of the Donner Party tragedy, this one published to commemorate the 30th anniversary of your departure from Illinois. The writer has gotten most of the facts wrong, embellished the dramatic moments, and reduced your complex experience to another sensational tale of cannibalism and moral failure. The article mentions that you're one of only 12 original survivors still living, though the count depends on who's doing the counting and which deaths get attributed to the lasting effects of the mountain ordeal. Some survivors have died from what the doctors call natural causes, but you know better. The mountains claimed some of your party immediately, others gradually, and a few are still being killed slowly by memories that never fade. You've become something of a reluctant historian, one of the few people still alive who can correct the increasingly wild inaccuracies that creep into published accounts. Reporters visit your home occasionally, seeking quotes for anniversary articles, but their questions reveal how far the story has drifted from reality. They want dramatic confrontations that never happened, heroic speeches that were never made, clear moral lessons that completely miss the psychological complexity of what you experienced. Here's what you've learned about being a historical figure while still alive to witness your own mythology. The The story belongs to the public now, not to the people who lived it. Writers, historians, and entertainers feel entitled to interpret your experience for their own purposes, creating versions that serve their artistic or moral agendas rather than historical accuracy. The children who survived the ordeal are now middle-aged adults with children of their own, passing down family stories that compete with public narratives for claim to truth. Some have embraced their legacy, building successful lives that honour their survival without being defined by it. Others remain haunted by experiences they barely understood at the time, and learned about mainly through hostile public scrutiny. Louis Kieserberg died 5 years ago, taking with him the accusations and suspicions that made him a convenient scapegoat for the group's collective survival choices. His obituary mentioned the Donner Party in the first paragraph, ensuring that even in death he remained defined by those desperate months beside Truckee Lake, rather than the subsequent decades he spent trying to build a normal life. Virginia Reed Murphy continues to correspond with historians and journalists, serving as the primary public voice for the survivors. Her articulate letters emphasise themes of perseverance and faith, while carefully avoiding the details that might disturb comfortable assumptions about civilization and moral behaviour. She's learned to tell the story in ways that honour the dead without traumatising the living. You maintain relationships with the other surviving members of your party, bonds forged in crisis that proved stronger than the social conventions that normally govern human interaction. These friendships are complicated by shared knowledge that can't be discussed openly, but they're also deeper than relationships built on comfortable circumstances. The physical landscape that nearly killed you has been transformed by American industry and engineering. The Central Pacific Railroad now crosses the Sierra Nevada, carrying passengers in heated cars through passes where you nearly froze to death. Tourists can travel from California to New York in days rather than months, insulated from the natural dangers that made your journey so perilous. But the psychological landscape remains unchanged. Human beings still face choices between moral principles and physical survival, still discover that the distance between civilization and savagery is shorter than comfortable assumptions suggest, still learn that extreme circumstances reveal character in ways that ordinary life never could. Listen to the sound of your story being absorbed into American mythology. It appears in children's textbooks as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper planning and moral behaviour. It shows up in political speeches about American values and the pioneer spirit. It gets referenced in sermons about maintaining faith under adversity and the temporary nature of earthly concerns. The phrase Donner Party has become shorthand for cannibalism, desperation, and the failure of American dreams. It appears in newspaper cartoons, casual conversation, and anywhere people need a reference point for extreme moral compromise or survival at any cost. Your individual human experience has been transformed into a cultural symbol that carries meanings you never intended and implications you don't necessarily support. Here's your final historical fact about survival and memory. The people who endure extreme experiences often become repositories for society's anxieties about civilization, morality, and human nature. Your story serves functions that have nothing to do with what actually happened to you, and everything to do with what other people need to believe about themselves and their society. You've outlived most of your fellow survivors and many of the people who turned your experience into entertainment. The reporters who sensationalized your story, the ministers who used it for moral instruction, the politicians who referenced it in speeches about American values. Most of them are dead now, but the version of your story they created continues to live into the popular imagination. The mountains remain on the eastern horizon, their snow-covered peaks visible from your parlour window. They've been conquered by technology and engineering, but they retain their beauty and their indifference to human ambition. The granite doesn't care about the stories told about what happened in its shadows, doesn't remember the people who died there or judge the ones who survived. Some nights you dream of the people who didn't make it out, the 39 members of your party who remain buried under California soil. They appear not as accusers or ghosts, but as companions who understood what you were all facing together. In the dreams, they're grateful that someone survived to remember them, to carry their story forward, to prove that they existed and mattered, despite the tragedy that claimed them. You wake from these dreams with a sense of responsibility that transcends the sensational versions of your experience. You're not just a survivor or a cautionary tale or a symbol of American ambition gone wrong. You're a witness to the full complexity of human nature under extreme pressure, a keeper of truths that can't be reduced to moral lessons or entertainment value. The taste of human flesh faded from memory decades ago, but the knowledge of what you're capable of when everything else is stripped away remains part of who you are. It's neither something to be proud of nor ashamed of, simply a fundamental truth about human survival that most people never have to confront. You survived the mountains, but the mountains also live in you, a permanent reminder of what lies beneath the comfortable surface of civilization. That knowledge is your burden and your gift, the price of survival and the wisdom that came with it. The snow still falls in the Sierra Nevada each winter, covering the sites where your companions died, and where you learned what it means to stay alive, when staying alive requires becoming someone you never imagined you could be. January 18th, 81, 34 years after your rescue. You're lying in your bed in San Jose, California, listening to rain against the windows and feeling the approach of your own final winter. The doctors say it's pneumonia, a common enough killer of people your age, but you know better. You're dying from the accumulated weight of carrying too much knowledge for too long, from being a keeper of truths that civilized society never wanted to face directly. Outside your window, the Sierra Nevada mountains gleam with fresh snow, beautiful and terrible and eternal. They've outlasted most of the people who tried to cross them that autumn of 1846, indifferent to human ambition, human suffering, human storytelling. The granite doesn't care about the legends that grew from your experience or the moral lessons that others extracted from your survival. You're one of the last. Of the 48 people who survived the Donner Party ordeal, fewer than 6 remain alive, scattered across a continent that has changed beyond recognition since you first set out for California. The country that drew you west with promises of gold and opportunity has been transformed by railroads, telegraphs, and the accumulated weight of manifest destiny fulfilled. The story of your experience has transformed as well, evolving from newspaper sensation to historical fact to cultural mythology. Each generation tells it differently, emphasizing the aspects that serve their contemporary needs, while ignoring the psychological complexity that made it genuinely tragic. You've become a symbol rather than a person, a cautionary tale rather than a survivor. Here's what you've learned about being historical while still alive, to witness your own legend. The truth becomes less important than the meaning people extract from the truth. The facts get adjusted to serve moral purposes you never intended, and support arguments you never made. Your individual human experience becomes community property, shaped by needs that have nothing to do with what you actually endured. Listen to the sound of memory settling into its final form, not the dramatic nightmares of your early years or the intrusive flashbacks of middle age, but a quiet integration of experience that no longer feels alien or overwhelming. You've made peace with what you had to do to survive, not because it was right or wrong, but because it was necessary and you were capable of it. The children who survived with you have grown into adults who carry their own versions of the story, filtered through childhood memory and adult understanding. Some have children of their own now, grandchildren who will inherit family legends that compete with textbook accounts for claim to historical truth. The story keeps evolving generation by generation, each retelling shaped by the values and needs of the people doing the telling. You think about the 39 members of your party who didn't survive the mountains, whose bodies lie buried in California soil or scattered across the Sierra Nevada wilderness. They've been dead longer now than they were alive when you knew them, but they remain vivid in your memory. Jacob Donner's quiet reliability, Baylis Williams' good humour, little Catherine Pike's brave smiles even when she was starving. The irony doesn't escape you that the dead have achieved a kind of immortality through the story of their deaths, while the survivors have been defined by what they did to stay alive rather than what they did with the lives they preserved. History remembers victims more clearly than it remembers those who refuse to become victims, but you remember both. You carry the full human complexity of people trying to maintain their dignity while doing undignified things, trying to preserve their morality while crossing moral boundaries, trying to stay human while survival required becoming something else. That complete picture exists nowhere in the public record, only in the memories of people who were there. The mountains taught you lessons that no school curriculum includes, truths about human nature that polite society prefers not to acknowledge. You learned that the distance between civilization and savagery is shorter than comfortable assumptions suggest, that moral principles are more flexible than absolute statements imply, that survival sometimes requires becoming someone you never imagined you could be. You also learned that crossing those boundaries doesn't automatically make you a monster or a saint, just a human being who faced choices that most people never have to contemplate. The knowledge of what you're capable of under extreme pressure is neither something to celebrate nor something to regret, simply part of the full spectrum of human possibility. Here's your final understanding about survival and memory. The people who endure extreme experiences often become repositories for society's anxieties about morality, civilization, and human nature. Your story serves functions that transcend your individual experience, carrying meanings that reflect the fears and values of the people who tell it. The rain continues against your window, and somewhere in the distance you can hear a train whistle, the sound of progress crossing the landscape that nearly killed you. The world has moved on from the desperate winter when you learned what human flesh tastes like, but you remain connected to that time and place in ways that transcend geographical distance or temporal separation. You close your eyes and remember the sound of snow falling on canvas, the whisper of wind through pine trees, the quiet conversations around fires that never provided enough heat. You remember the faces of people who didn't make it out, the weight of choices that seemed impossible at the time but proved manageable when the alternative was death. The mountains are still there, covered with snow that falls and melts and falls again in cycles older than human memory. The granite remains indifferent to the stories told about what happened in its shadows, but it preserves the sites where ordinary people discovered the extraordinary lengths they would go to stay alive. You survived the Donner Party, but the Donner Party also lives in you, a permanent part of your identity that shaped every subsequent day of your life. The person who entered those mountains in 1846 died there, replaced by someone who carried forward the knowledge of what survival costs when it requires everything you have. The taste of human flesh faded from memory decades ago, but the knowledge that you were capable of eating it never did. That knowledge is your burden and your gift, the price of survival, and the wisdom that came with paying it. The snow still falls in the Sierra Nevada each winter, beautiful and terrible and eternal, covering the sites where your story unfolded and where it continues to unfold in the imagination of people who need to understand what human beings are really capable of when everything comfortable gets stripped away. Your breath grows shallower, but your memory remains clear. You're ready to join the 39 who didn't make it out of the mountains, carrying with you the full truth of what happened during that desperate winter when the snow fell early and the food ran out and ordinary people learned what they were truly made of. The mountains remember everything and judge nothing. Soon you'll be part of that eternal silence, another name on the list of people who tried to cross the Sierra Nevada and paid the full price for the attempt, whether they survived or not. The story continues without you, told and retold by people who weren't there, shaped by needs and values you can't predict or control, but you lived the truth, carried it for 34 years, and now you can finally set it down. The snow keeps falling, and the mountains keep their secrets, and somewhere in the distance, another train whistle sounds, carrying passengers safely across passes where you nearly died, learning what it means to stay alive. When staying alive costs everything you thought that you were.